The flashbulbs were a volley of silent thunder, and John Smith soaked them in his hand possessively on the bare, silk-clad back of the woman beside him. Her name was Amber, and she was not his wife. He was the king of New York tonight, the master of his universe, and she was his chosen queen. Across town, Irina Smith adjusted the diamond clasp on a necklace that had been in her family for generations, a cold, determined smile touching her lips. She knew exactly where her husband was and who he was with. What John didn't know was that the empire he was flaunting was never his to begin with, and the woman he'd discarded was about to reclaim her kingdom in front of the entire world. The Smith penthouse on Park Avenue was a monument to success, a silent testament to John's ambition. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan, a sprawling kingdom of glittering lights that on nights like this, John felt he owned. The air was sterile, conditioned to a perfect 72 degrees, and smelled faintly of lemon oil and John's self-satisfaction. For Irina Vance Smith, however, it smelled of loneliness. For 10 years, she had been the perfect wife. She'd curated their home into a feature for Architectural Digest, hosted flawless dinner parties for board members, and stood smiling by John's side as he accepted awards for being a titan of industry. He was the CEO of Vance Smith Industries, a sprawling conglomerate specializing in luxury real estate and tech investments. He was the public face, the charismatic deal maker. She was the silent partner, the elegant accessory. At least that's how he saw her. The illusion had been fraying for years, the silken threads of their marriage snapping one by one. It began with the late nights he dismissed as closing deals, the calls he'd take in the other room, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It grew with the casual cruelty, the way he'd correct her in front of friends or mock the literature degree she'd earned before they met. "My Ellie," he'd say with a patronizing chuckle, "she lives in a world of poetry and fairy tales. I handle the real world." Tonight, the final thread was about to be severed. The Metropolitan Benefactors Gala was the crown jewel of the New York social season. It was an event sponsored in large part by Vance Smith Industries. It was the one night of the year John was expected to shine brightest with his beautiful wife on his arm. He had strolled into her dressing room an hour ago, not even bothering to loosen the Tom Ford tie he'd knotted with practiced ease. He smelled of expensive cologne and a lie he hadn't even bothered to construct properly. "Darling," he began, the endearment sounding like an insult. "There's been a last-minute change of plans." Irina was sitting at her vanity, the soft glow of the mirror lights illuminating the quiet resignation in her eyes. She met his gaze in the reflection. "Oh, an investor. A huge one from Dubai. He's skittish. Wants a one-on-one tonight. I have to go to the gala alone, press the flesh, make him feel secure. It's business, you understand." He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed dark hair. "It's a dreadful bore. You'd hate it. Better you stay home, relax. Read one of your books." Irina's fingers tightened around a silver-backed brush. For a decade she had accepted these flimsy excuses. She had swallowed her pride, quelled her suspicions, and played the part of the understanding, supportive wife. She had done it because she loved the man he once was, or the man she thought he was. The charming, ambitious man who had pursued her relentlessly, swearing he loved her for her mind and her quiet strength, not just the Vance family name. But that man was gone, replaced by this arrogant stranger who thought she was a fool. She turned from the mirror to face him, forcing a placid smile. "Of course, John. I understand completely, Business comes first. He beamed, his relief palpable. He didn't see the ice forming in her blue eyes. He only saw compliance. "That's my girl. I knew you'd get it." He leaned down and kissed her cheek, a dry, dismissive peck. "Don't wait up." And with that, he was gone. The heavy oak door of her dressing room clicked shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. Irina stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate. She walked over to the window, looking down at the river of yellow cabs and black cars flowing through the concrete canyons below. He thought she was a fool. He thought she was weak. He thought she was just another one of his assets, a beautiful piece of property to be housed in his penthouse. He had forgotten who she was. He had forgotten that before she was a Smith, she was a Vance. And the Vances did not build empires by being fools. A single cold tear traced a path down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of rage. The cage, gilded as it was, had become a prison, and tonight she was not just going to escape. She was going to burn it to the ground. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over a number she hadn't dialed in years. It was time to call in the architect of the entire Vance legacy. The seed of suspicion had been planted months ago, a tiny bitter thing that Irina had tried to ignore. It was a receipt, a simple slip of paper that had fallen from John's coat pocket. It was from a little-known but ridiculously expensive lingerie boutique in Soho called Fleur Secrète. The purchase was for a silk and lace set in a size far smaller than her own, and a bottle of perfume she didn't wear. The date on the receipt corresponded with a night he'd claimed to be in a grueling all-night negotiation with a firm from Tokyo. At the time, she'd convinced herself it was a gift for a client's wife. A business courtesy. It was easier to believe a comforting lie than to confront a devastating truth. But after John left for the gala, the lie crumbled into dust. The cold certainty she felt wasn't just intuition. It was a conclusion built on 100 other tiny betrayals. She went to his study, a room that was more of a shrine to himself than an office. Diplomas, awards, and framed magazine covers featuring his face lined the mahogany walls. She ran her hand along his cold, imposing desk, her mind racing. He was arrogant, but he was also careless. Arrogance bred carelessness. Her fingers found a small, almost invisible indentation on the underside of the desk. A hidden latch. Years ago he'd shown it to her, boasting about his little James Bond secret. Inside was a small, velvet-lined compartment where he kept a spare watch and a few other personal items. And tucked beneath them a second phone. A burner phone. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she powered it on. It was locked, of course. But John's ego was his greatest weakness. The password was his birthday. Too simple. She tried his Man of the Year award date. Nothing. Then she tried the stock ticker symbol for Vance Smith Industries, VCI. The phone unlocked. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. The symbol of the company her family had built was the key to unlocking his deceit. The message history was a sickening chronicle of his affair. The recipient was saved under the initial A, on my way, wearing the red dress. You'll be the only one I see tonight. John. I can't wait. Tonight everyone will see who the real queen is. A is your wife going, John? Please. I told her I had a business meeting. She bought it as usual. She'll be at home reading her dusty old books. The name Amber appeared in an earlier text, a confirmation for a dinner reservation. Amber Collins. Irina's blood ran cold. She knew the name. Amber was a junior marketing executive at the company, known more for her ambition and her flirtatious demeanor at company parties than for her professional acumen. She was young, beautiful, and utterly transparent in her goals. The messages went back months. Lavish gifts, secret trips to the Caribbean, promises of a future together once John handled the situation with his wife. He referred to Irina as a formality, a relic of a past business arrangement. He had reduced their 10-year marriage to a contractual obligation he was eager to terminate. The personal betrayal was a physical blow, leaving her breathless. But as she scrolled further, a different kind of anger began to smolder. Interspersed with the sordid messages were discussions about the company. John just leveraged the Aspen property for the new acquisition. The board is too old and slow to see the genius of it. They only see risk. Amber. You're a visionary, John. They're holding you back. John. Once Ellie is out of the picture, her family's influence on the board will be gone. I can finally run this company the way it's meant to be run. No more looking over my shoulder. He wasn't just cheating on her. He was gambling with her family's legacy. Vance Industries had been founded by her grandfather and built into a powerhouse by her father, Anthony Vance. It was built on principles of stability, integrity, and long-term vision. John's talk of leverage and risk was the opposite of everything her father stood for. He was treating the company like his personal casino. The pain in her chest crystallized into something hard and sharp resolve. This was no longer just about a broken heart. It was about saving the work of generations from the reckless ego of the man she had once loved. She put the phone back, wiping it clean of her fingerprints. She walked calmly to her own office, a bright, airy room filled with the books John so openly disdained. She unlocked a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. The documents inside were old, the paper soft with age. It was the original incorporation charter for Vance Industries and the shareholder agreement from when it merged with a smaller firm to become Vance Smith. Most importantly, it contained the papers for the private family trust her father had established years ago. She had read them countless times, but this time she read them with new eyes. John was the CEO. He had significant shares, yes, a generous gift upon their marriage. But he was, in essence, an employee, a highly paid, powerful manager. The controlling interest, a staggering 51% of the voting shares, was held not by her father, but by the Vance family trust. And the sole beneficiary and trustee of that trust upon her 30th birthday, 5 years ago, had become Irina Vance Smith. John had forgotten this. Or perhaps in his hubris, he had come to believe his own myth that he, through sheer force of will, was the majority owner. He had grown comfortable believing her to be passive and uninterested in the real world. He had mistaken her quiet nature for weakness. That was about to be the most costly mistake of his life. She picked up her phone again and dialed the number she had hesitated over earlier. It rang 3 times before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Irina, father." She said her own voice, steady and clear, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "I need your help. I'm coming to see you, right now." The helicopter ride north was a blur of city lights, giving way to the dark, sleeping suburbs. Then the dense blackness of the forests of upstate New York. Irina barely noticed. She sat staring out at the void, the damning text messages burning in her mind. The rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of the rotor blades was a war drum counting down the hours until her old life was utterly demolished, and a new one began. Anthony Vance had retired from the world a decade ago, shortly after Irina's marriage. After a lifetime spent building an empire and a minor health scare that served as a major wake-up call, he had retreated to a sprawling estate in the Adirondacks. He called it the Eyrie. It was a fortress of stone and glass built into the side of a mountain, accessible only by a winding private road or by air. He had traded boardrooms for libraries and stock tickers for trout streams. He rarely came to the city, and he never, ever interfered in the running of the company he had passed on. He had trusted John to be a worthy steward, both for his company and for his daughter. The helicopter landed on a private helipad lit by soft, glowing markers. A rugged-looking man in a flannel jacket was waiting to escort her to the main house. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and cold stone. It was a world away from the perfumed, polluted air of Manhattan. Anthony was waiting for her in his study. The room was vast, with a 2-story wall of books on one side and a massive stone fireplace on the other, where a log fire crackled and spat. He was not the titan of industry she remembered from her childhood. Age had softened his features, and his once jet-black hair was now a distinguished silver, but his eyes, the same piercing blue as hers, were as sharp and intelligent as ever. He stood as she entered his expression, a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Irina," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You look pale. What's happened?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She walked to the large oak desk in the center of the room and laid out her evidence like a prosecutor. She placed the burner phone on the polished wood. She had taken pictures of the key messages and printed them. She then produced the financial reports she'd had her personal accountant quietly pull, highlighting the leveraged properties and the high-risk ventures John had undertaken without full board disclosure. "John is having an affair," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "With an employee. Tonight he took her to the benefactor's gala. He lied to me, and he is humiliating me. That I can handle. But he is also destroying your company, Father. He's gambling with our legacy, using it as his personal piggy bank to fund his ego." Anthony was silent for a long time. He picked up the printed messages, his brow furrowed. He read Amber's fawning praise and John's arrogant dismissals of his wife and board. He then moved to the financial reports, his eyes scanning the numbers with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime reading balance sheets. A muscle in his jaw twitched. The quiet retiree vanished, and in his place was the lion who had dominated Wall Street for 40 years. The boy always had more ambition than sense, Anthony said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I thought you would temper that. I thought your marriage would ground him." "He thinks I'm a fool," Irina replied, her voice cracking for the first time. "He thinks I'm a decorative object with no understanding of the real world. He forgot where the money came from. He forgot whose name is on the door." "No," Anthony corrected, his gaze locking with hers. "He forgot whose name is on the trust. He forgot who holds the power." He walked to the window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the mountain night. "When your mother died, I promised I would protect you. Part of that was letting you live your own life, make your own choices, even your own mistakes." I stepped back. I gave him rope, believing he would build a ladder, not a noose. He turned back to her, his eyes blazing. "He has disrespected my company. He has disrespected my legacy. But worst of all, he has disrespected my daughter. That is a transgression I will not tolerate." The plan began to form in that room by the crackling fire, a strategy devised by 2 generations of Vance ingenuity. It was audacious, public, and utterly ruthless. It was a plan designed not just to remove John, but to annihilate his reputation so completely that he would never work in this town again. "What do you need me to do?" Irina asked, her strength returning fortified by her father's fury. First, Anthony said, a grim smile touching his lips. "You need to change. That dress is for a victim. You are going to a coronation, not a funeral. Go upstairs. Your mother's gowns are still in her closet. Find the one she called her armor." While Irina went upstairs, Anthony made 2 calls. The first was to Marcus Thorne, the family's lawyer for 50 years, a man whose loyalty to the Vances was absolute. He instructed him to prepare an injunction and the paperwork for an emergency board meeting. The second call was to the head of security at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a man who owed Anthony a significant favor. An hour later, Irina descended the grand staircase. She had found the dress. It was a couture gown of deep crimson silk that her mother had worn to the White House years ago. It was elegant, powerful, and utterly breathtaking. With her hair swept up and her family's diamonds at her neck, she was no longer John Smith's discarded wife. She was Irina Vance, daughter of Anthony Vance, and the true owner of an empire. Anthony looked at her, and for a moment the fierce businessman was replaced by a proud father. "Perfect," he breathed. "He won't know what hit him." He offered her his arm. "Shall we, my dear? It's been a long time since I've attended a party. I believe it's time to remind New York society who the Vances are." The grand hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a glittering sea of power and influence. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, cast a golden glow over the city's elite. Senators rubbed shoulders with tech billionaires, and celebrated artists chatted with silver-haired doyens of old society. The air itself seemed to hum with the collective energy of 1,000 egos, all vying for attention, for validation, for a moment in the spotlight. And tonight, the spotlight belonged to John Smith. He stood near the base of the grand staircase, a flute of champagne in one hand, the other resting proprietorially on Amber Collins's waist. She was a vision in a daring red dress, the one she'd texted him about. It was cut low in the front and high on the thigh, a stark, screaming contrast to Irina's classic and understated elegance. Amber was fire-loud and bright, and John was using her to signal his own virility and power. He was holding court. People gravitated towards him, drawn by the magnetic pull of his success. He was the CEO of Vance Smith, the primary sponsor of the evening and the man of the hour. He laughed a deep, confident sound that echoed in the cavernous hall. He introduced Amber not as his mistress, but with a carefully chosen ambiguous title. "This is Amber Collins," he announced to a cluster of admirers, including the influential gossip columnist Beatrice Fairfax. "My brilliant protégée. She's the future of our marketing division. A real rising star." Amber preened under the attention, her smile wide and predatory. She looked at the faces around her, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the new money titans, and saw her own reflection in their envious eyes. She had done it. She had clawed her way out of obscurity and into the absolute center of power. She was on the arm of the most important man in the room. The meek, boring wife was a distant memory, a footnote in the story of her glorious ascent. Whispers followed them as they moved through the room. "Isn't he married?" a woman murmured behind her fan. To Anthony Vance's daughter, her companion replied, the quiet one. Dreadfully dull, I hear. Well, this one is anything but dull. Look at that dress. You could floss with that thing. The gossip only fueled John's arrogance. He enjoyed the scandal. It made him feel virile, powerful, a man who took what he wanted. He believed he had insulated himself so thoroughly within the company, made himself so indispensable, that he was untouchable. Irina, with her gentle nature and her lack of interest in business, posed no threat. The board was composed of old men who were dazzled by the company's recent and risky profit margins. He was the king, and this gala was his coronation ball. He caught the eye of Beatrice Fairfax, the columnist, who was watching him with a shrewd, calculating gaze. He gave her a conspiratorial wink. He was feeding the beast, creating the narrative himself. The story would be about the dynamic CEO and his brilliant new star, a changing of the guard. Mr. Smith, Beatrice said, her voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of steel. A bold move coming with Ms. Collins tonight. Whereas Irina John's smile didn't falter. My wife is feeling a bit under the weather. She sends her regrets. She insisted I come and represent the company, and that I bring my most promising executive with me. Irina is all about fostering new talent. It was a masterful lie delivered with such casual confidence that it was almost believable. Amber squeezed his arm, her eyes shining with adoration. He was powerful, charming, and utterly in control. The evening's host, the museum director, tapped a glass for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention, in a few moments we will be hearing from the man whose incredible generosity has made this evening possible. He is a visionary leader, a pillar of our community, and a true titan of industry. Please prepare a warm welcome for the CEO of Vance Smith Industries, Mr. John Smith. A ripple of applause went through the room. This was it, the apex of his career. John straightened his bow tie, gave Amber a quick, triumphant kiss, and began to make his way towards the stage set up at the foot of the staircase. He felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on him. He felt like a god ascending Olympus. He was so blinded by the spotlight, so deafened by the applause, that he didn't notice the sudden collective intake of breath from the crowd near the main entrance. He didn't see the whispers turn from speculation to stunned silence. He didn't see the sea of faces part as two figures made their way through the throng. He was just 2 steps from the stage, his victory speech already on his lips, when the great oak doors at the far end of the hall swung fully open, and a hush fell over the entire gala. The silence was so profound, so sudden, that it was more powerful than any noise. John stopped confused. He turned, following the gaze of every single person in the room, and his world stopped turning. The silence in the grand hall was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the soft strains of the string quartet. It all vanished, sucked into a vacuum of collective shock. Every head was turned towards the grand entrance, where 2 figures stood, silhouetted against the bright lights of the foyer. As they stepped forward into the warm glow of the hall, the gasps began. They were quiet at first, little ripples of disbelief, but they quickly grew into a tidal wave of astonished whispers that swept through the crowd. It was Irina, but it was not the Irina anyone knew. Gone was the quiet, conservatively dressed society wife who faded into the background. In her place stood a queen. She wore a gown of crimson silk that seemed to drink the light, a stark, regal statement against the sea of black tuxedos and pastel dresses. The Vance diamonds glittered at her throat, not as mere ornaments, but as armor. Her posture was erect, her shoulders back, her chin held high. Her face, which John had so often called pleasantly plain, was transformed by a look of cold, unshakable resolve. She was incandescent with a fury so pure it was beautiful. But it wasn't just Irina's transformation that had stolen the breath of New York's high society. It was the man on whose arm she leaned. He was older, with a mane of silver hair, and a face etched with the lines of a life lived at the highest levels of power. He moved with a quiet authority that needed no announcement. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored tuxedo, but he may as well have been wearing coronation robes. He was a myth, a legend, a ghost from the golden age of Wall Street. It was Anthony Vance. For a decade, he had been a recluse, a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones. Most of the younger people in the room had never even seen him in person. But the older generation, the real power brokers, recognized him instantly. They were the ones who had witnessed his genius, who had feared his ruthlessness, and who had respected his absolute integrity. His presence here tonight was the equivalent of a king returning from exile. John stood frozen halfway to the stage. His mind simply couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. Irina here, looking like that, and with her father. It was impossible. Anthony never came to the city. He hated these events. And Irina. She was supposed to be at home reading a book, blissfully unaware. Amber, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, tightened her grip on John's arm. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice laced with unease. "Why is everyone staring?" John couldn't answer. His mouth was dry, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw Beatrice Fairfax, the columnist, her eyes wide, a wolfish grin spreading across her face. She was smelling the biggest society story of the decade. Irina and Anthony moved through the parted crowd with regal slowness. They didn't look at anyone. Their eyes were fixed on one target, John. Every step they took was a judgment. Every meter they crossed was another nail in his coffin. The crowd, sensing a confrontation of epic proportions, instinctively backed away, creating a wide, clear path between the entrance and the stage like an executioner's lane. As they drew closer, John could see Irina's eyes. The warm, forgiving blue he knew was gone. In its place was a glacial ice, a chilling emptiness that promised no mercy. The placid, accommodating woman he had married was gone. In her place was a stranger, a Vance, and she was looking at him not with the pain of a betrayed wife, but with the cold contempt of a CEO looking at an underperforming asset about to be liquidated. Anthony's gaze was even more terrifying. It was the look of a creator surveying a flawed creation just before he smashes it to pieces. There was no anger, no passion, just a profound, quiet disappointment that was somehow infinitely worse. They stopped a few feet from John and Amber. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. The entire social and financial elite of New York was holding its breath, waiting. Finally, Anthony spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of his legacy, cutting through the silence and reaching every corner of the vast hall. He didn't look at John. He looked past him towards the museum director, who was still standing dumbfounded on the stage. "I believe Anthony Vance," said his voice as cold and clear as a winter morning, "that there has been a mistake in the evening's program. Mr. Smith will not be speaking tonight." John's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Anthony Vance's words, spoken so calmly, were not a request. They were a decree. The world tilted on its axis, the glittering ballroom seeming to warp and bend around him. He finally found his voice, a strangled, incredulous croak. "Anthony," "Irina, what is the meaning of this? What are you doing here?" He forced a laugh, a hollow, desperate sound. "Trying to surprise me." "Well, you've certainly done that." He turned to the crowd, trying to reclaim control to frame this as a bizarre family prank. "My father-in-law, ladies and gentlemen, always one for a dramatic entrance." No one laughed. No one even smiled. They were watching a public execution, and they were mesmerized. Anthony took a deliberate step forward. He addressed the crowd, now his voice resonating with an authority John could only ever imitate. "Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anthony Vance. I founded the company that generously sponsored this wonderful event tonight. I have been retired for 10 years, content to leave the running of my life's work in what I believed were capable hands." His eyes finally settled on John, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "It has come to my attention," Anthony continued, "that my faith was misplaced. Vance Smith Industries was built on a foundation of integrity, stability, and fiduciary responsibility. Recently, under the leadership of Mr. Smith, the company has engaged in a series of reckless, highly leveraged acquisitions that have put the entire enterprise at risk. He has done so without the full, transparent approval of the board, and more importantly, without the approval of the majority shareholder." A collective gasp went through the room. Majority shareholder. Everyone thought John was the one in charge. John's face went white. "Now just a minute," he sputtered, taking a step towards Anthony. "That's privileged company information. This is not the time or the place. This is precisely the time and the place." Irina's voice cut in sharp and clear as shattered glass. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sound of her voice, so full of command, stunned John into silence. She glided past her father to stand directly in front of John and Amber. She looked at Amber, her eyes sweeping over the cheap shock of the red dress and the desperate ambition in the younger woman's face. There was no jealousy in her gaze, only a sort of weary pity. "Miss Collins," Irina said, her voice dangerously soft. "You are the rising star, I presume. The brilliant protégé." She let the words hang in the air, dripping with sarcasm. "You hitched your wagon to a man who promised you a kingdom. I feel it's my duty to inform you that you've been riding with a court jester who was merely allowed to sit on the throne for a while." Amber paled, her triumphant smile dissolving into a mask of horror and confusion. She looked at John, her eyes silently begging him to fix this, to reassert the power she had found so intoxicating. But John was speechless, floundering. Irina turned her full attention to her husband. "You thought I was a fool, John. You thought I was content to live in your shadow, oblivious, while you played with my family's money and slept with your subordinates. You mistook my patience for weakness. You mistook my silence for ignorance." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow audible to everyone in the silent hall. "Let me be very clear. You are the CEO, a title, an employee. I am the majority shareholder, the owner. The Vance Family Trust, of which I am the sole trustee, controls 51% of this company. Your reign is over." From the edge of the crowd, a man in a dark suit stepped forward. It was Marcus Thorne, the Vance family lawyer. He handed a folder to the museum's head of security, who then approached John. Mr. Smith, the security head, said, his voice formal and unsympathetic, "You are being served with a court injunction barring you from entering any Vance Smith property, effective immediately, There will be an emergency board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. to vote on your termination for cause." John stared at the papers as if they were written in a dead language. His empire, his identity, his entire world had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes in front of everyone who mattered. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant confidence, crumbled. He looked around wildly, seeking an ally, a friendly face, but all he saw was a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled schadenfreude. He turned to Irina, his eyes pleading. "Ellie, please, we can talk about this at home. Don't do this." Irina looked at him, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It was not love, not even hatred. It was a profound and final indifference. "There is no home anymore, John," she said. "And my name is Irina Vance." She turned her back on him. Anthony took the microphone from the podium on the stage. "My apologies for the interruption," he announced to the stunned audience. "Please enjoy the rest of your evening." Vance Smith. Industries is now under new management. Stable management. And I am pleased to announce that the board will be voting to appoint its new interim chairwoman tomorrow morning. My daughter Irina Vance. The finality of it was absolute. John Smith was no longer just a cheating husband. He was a footnote. A publicly disgraced unemployed footnote. His gaze fell on Amber, who was already backing away, disentangling herself from him, as if he were radioactive. Her dream had become a nightmare. She had attached herself to a falling star, and she was about to be crushed in the impact. Without a word, she turned and fled. Disappearing into the shocked crowd, her red dress a final pathetic flash of her failed ambitions. John stood alone, bathed in the spotlight he had so craved, utterly and completely destroyed. The chaos that erupted after Anthony Vance's announcement was immediate and overwhelming. The Gala, once a bastion of decorum, descended into a frantic buzz of gossip. Cell phones emerged, thumbs flying across screens, as the city's elite raced to be the first to break the most spectacular social and corporate implosion in a generation. John remained frozen for a moment longer, a statue of ruin in the center of the storm. Then the head of security touched his elbow. "Sir, I have to ask you to leave." The touch, though gentle, was firm. It broke the spell. John's face contorted in a mask of pure rage and humiliation. He looked at Irina's back as she stood calmly beside her father, accepting quiet congratulations from a few old family friends who were now rushing to her side. He opened his mouth to shout, to curse, to deny, but no words came out. He was a king without a kingdom, a voice without power. Flanked by 2 security guards, he was escorted out through a side door, not as a titan of industry, but as a trespasser. Irina did not watch him go. Her past was being swept out with the trash. Her focus was on the future. The rest of the evening was a blur of handshakes, murmurs of support, and looks of newfound respect. People who had barely acknowledged her for a decade now clamored for her attention. She was no longer John's quiet wife. She was the power in the room, the new sun around which they all suddenly orbited. The following morning, the news was everywhere. The Wall Street Journal ran the headline, "Vance returns. Heir apparent ousts CEO Croft in dramatic coup." Beatrice Fairfax's column was even more direct. "Gala of the damned Crofts' reign ends in public humiliation." The stories detailed John's affair, his reckless business dealings, and the stunning revelation of Irina's true position. The 9 a.m. board meeting was a formality. The board members, who had been cowed by John's aggressive style, fell in line immediately under the steely gaze of Anthony Vance, who attended via video conference. The vote to terminate John was unanimous. The vote to install Irina Vance as interim chairwoman was also unanimous. When the meeting was over, Irina walked down the hallway to the corner office. The large, ostentatious brass plate on the door still read, "John Smith, Chief Executive Officer." She ran her fingers over the letters, then looked at the building's head of maintenance, who stood waiting with a toolbox. "Please have this removed," she said calmly. "Immediately." She pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The office was just like the rest of John's life, a monument to his own ego. A massive, imposing desk dominated the space. The walls were covered with photos of him shaking hands with politicians, grinning on sailboats and accepting awards. His scent, that arrogant, expensive cologne, still lingered in the air. For a moment she felt a pang of something. Not sadness, but a strange sense of loss for the woman she had been. The naive young woman who had believed in fairy tales, who had loved a man that never truly existed. She had been weak, trusting, and complacent. That woman had died last night. Irina walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the same view she had from her penthouse prison. But from here, it felt different. It was not a gilded cage. It was a kingdom. Her kingdom. She looked down at the bustling streets of Manhattan, the arteries of commerce and power, and felt not fear or inadequacy, but a surge of profound, invigorating purpose. She spent the rest of the day in a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, department heads, and accountants. She was decisive, intelligent, and utterly in command. The years she had spent quietly reading, observing, and learning the very things John had mocked had prepared her for this moment. She absorbed complex financial data, asked insightful questions, and laid out a clear, concise plan to stabilize the company and undo the damage John had caused. The staff, who had lived in fear of John's volatile temper, looked at her with a mixture of awe and relief. Late in the afternoon, her father called. "How does the chair feel?" he asked, a rare note of humor in his voice. "A little large," Irina admitted, a small smile touching her lips. "But I think I'll grow into it." "I have no doubt," Anthony said, his voice thick with pride. "Your mother would have been so proud, Irina. You are truly a Vance." After she hung up, she sat in the deepening twilight, the city lights beginning to twinkle to life below. She was no longer Mrs. John Smith. She was not even just Anthony Vance's daughter. She was Irina Vance, the chairwoman of Vance Smith Industries. She had been tested by the deepest betrayal, and instead of breaking, she had been forged into steel. Her revenge was not just in taking John's job, it was in being brilliant at it. Her triumph was not just in winning, but in reclaiming herself. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a decade, it was her own. And she was ready to walk it. The St. Regis Hotel suite was by any measure a pinnacle of luxury. Gilded fixtures gleamed, the bed was the size of a small country, and a bottle of complimentary champagne sat sweating in a silver bucket. For John Smith, it was a prison. He had stumbled here in the early hours of the morning, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of fury and disbelief. He'd been on his phone ever since a general trying to rally an army that had already deserted. His first call was to his lawyer, a man who had been on his payroll for a decade. The response was clinical. "John, I'm sorry. My primary duty is to the corporation. Given the circumstances and the clear instructions from the majority shareholder, representing you would be a catastrophic conflict of interest. You'll need to find new counsel." The line went dead. He tried the board members one by one. Men he had golfed with whose backs he had slapped at expensive dinners. Most didn't answer. The one who did, a senior director named George Matheson, was brief. "You brought this on yourself, son. You played with Anthony Vance's money, and you humiliated his daughter. There's no coming back from that. Lose my number." Desperation clawed at him. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over Amber's name. He called. The call didn't even ring. It went straight to a recorded message. "The number you have dialed has blocked incoming calls from your number." Blocked. The woman who had sworn he was a visionary, who had looked at him with doe-eyed adoration just 24 hours ago, had already cut him loose. She was a cockroach scurrying from the light, and he had been a fool to think her loyalty was to him and not to the power he wielded. He threw the phone across the room, where it hit the silk-papered wall with a pathetic thud. He was utterly, completely alone. The power he thought he possessed, the loyalty he thought he commanded, it was all an illusion. It had never been his. It was rented, borrowed from the Vance name, and his lease had been terminated in the most public way imaginable. The silence of the hotel room was deafening, broken only by the frantic, panicked thumping of his own heart. He was John Smith, but without the title, without the company, the name meant nothing. He was a ghost haunting a life that was no longer his. Meanwhile, 40 blocks south, Irina Vance was not haunting an old life. She was building a new one. She arrived at the Vance-Smith building at 7 a.m. sharp, not in a chauffeured town car, but in a taxi. She wanted to walk through the front doors on her own 2 feet. The office was already buzzing with the news, and as she walked through the lobby, a hush fell. People stared, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. She offered a small, professional smile and a nod, her calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Her first order of business was to meet with the head of human resources. Ms. Vance, the woman, a stern but fair executive named Carol, began. "Regarding Amber Collins, her employment is to be terminated." Irina stated, her voice even. "For gross misconduct and a violation of the company's fraternization policy. Offer her the standard severance. Have security escort her from the building. No drama, no spectacle. We've had enough of that. We are a place of business, not a tabloid." Carol nodded, visibly relieved. "Understood, ma'am." Irina's command was absolute, but it wasn't tyrannical. It was efficient. She spent the morning in back-to-back meetings, methodically untangling the web of high-risk deals John had initiated. She discovered he had leveraged company assets to near breaking point to fund a vanity project, a speculative tech venture with no clear path to profitability. He had been playing roulette with her family's legacy. With each document she reviewed, her resolve hardened. This was no longer about personal betrayal. It was a rescue mission. Around noon, her assistant buzzed. "Ma'am, it's a Mr. Smith on your private line. He's been calling repeatedly. I told him you were unavailable." Irina held up a hand. "It's all right, Maria. Put him through." She leaned back in her new leather chair, a chair that fit her perfectly, and picked up the receiver. "What do you want, John?" she asked, her tone flat. His voice came through the line, a ragged, desperate sound she barely recognized. "Ellie, thank God! Ellie, you can't do this. We need to talk. This is insane." "There is nothing to talk about," she replied calmly. "The board has voted. The injunction is in place. It's over. Over 10 years of marriage over. Just like that. Because of one mistake," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You're destroying my life. Our life over a moment of weakness." Irina almost laughed. A moment. It was 100 moments, 1,000 lies. Our life was a fiction, you wrote, John. And your mistake was not the affair. Your mistake was believing I was a fool. Your mistake was gambling with my father's company. This is not an emotional decision. This is a business decision. Business, he spat, the desperation turning to his old familiar venom. You don't know the first thing about business. You're a librarian in a ball gown. You'll run Vance Smith into the ground in 6 months. There it was. The sneering condescension she had lived with for a decade. But now it had no power over her. It was the impotent snarling of a caged animal. That is a risk the majority shareholder is willing to take, she said, her voice as cold as steel. Goodbye, Mr. Smith. Do not contact me again. Any further communication will be through our respective lawyers. I believe you are in the process of finding one. She hung up the phone before he could reply, the click of the receiver, a final, definitive end. She did not feel sorrow. She did not feel anger. She felt quiet, a profound and peaceful quiet. The nagging background noise of John's ego, which had dominated her life for so long, was finally gone. She stood and walked to the vast window looking down at the city. It was her city now. The empire was hers to command. The ashes of her old life, of her marriage, were behind her. From them, she would build something stronger, something more honest, something that was entirely her own. She was no longer a wife, an accessory, or a secret. She was Irina Vance, and she was just getting started. Irina's story is a powerful reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most formidable. She endured betrayal, not with tears, but with strategy, turning her deepest pain into her greatest source of power. She didn't just get even. She got everything. By reclaiming her family's legacy, she reclaimed her own life, proving that a person's worth is never determined by who they stand beside, but by the strength with which they stand on their own. It's a testament to the fact that you can never underestimate a woman who has finally decided to fight for herself. What did you think of John's epic downfall and Irina's triumphant rise? Let us know your favorite part of her revenge in the comments below. If you loved this story of empowerment and justice, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs a dose of inspiration, and subscribing for more unforgettable tales. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a single story of a queen reclaiming her throne.